welcome to the CSPI podcast. I'm here with Bryan Caplan. Bryan, how are you today?
I'm doing fantastic. Thanks for having me on, Richard.
Great. And I think most of our listeners are probably know who you are, but for those who may not or who may not be familiar with all your work, can you give a little bit of an introduction?
Right. Well, so I'm a professor of economics at George Mason University, and I am the author of The Myth of the Rational Voter, Selfish Reasons to Have More Kids, The Case Against Education, and Open Borders. And the last book is a New York Times bestseller.
Yeah. And so I read The Myth of the Rational Voter. I read the Open Borders book.
Mm-hmm.
And they were both interesting, and I got a lot out of them. I started to read The Case Against Education, and I think I read about a third to a half of it. And I was just like, I agree with this too much. So there's nothing surprising here. So it
goes against what almost all experts in education economics actually say. So
yeah,
yes, I do get that a lot of like, isn't this obvious? Like, well, it's not obvious to the people who devote their lives to the topic. So there is that problem.
Or the general public, or every country in the world that has a lot of compulsory schooling and gives advantages to people with college degrees. It's not. You have to remember what's obvious for me or you is not obvious for everybody. And then the selfish reasons to have more kids. I actually I know quite a bit about the behavioral genetics literature. Mm-hmm. So I've read both Judith Rich Harris's books and Steven Pinker, The Blank Slate, and I've looked a little more deeply into it because I just find these questions to be so fascinating. So I've read a lot of the underlying research. So I just never picked it up because I thought, this is just going to be like Case Against Education, where I agree with everything. And I've also thought about the implications of the behavioral genetics research, which I've always thought that people don't take seriously enough. So what I was thinking about when I was thinking about all your books is I was trying to find a common theme. And I think it's something along the lines of, and you tell me if this is right, I don't think you're answering questions that are hard. Like I don't think any book is like a question where you look at it and you say, oh, it's like sort of like 55 this way and 45%, the opposite case. I think you're picking things where you think there's an overwhelming case for something. And people are just not taking seriously enough, and they really need to beat it into their heads, and that there are all kinds of moral and economic and political implications of these big ideas. Is that how you sort of?
Yeah, that's very fair. So the way that I often describe it is I only write books about orphaned ideas that are just living on the street. No one loves them. And then I come along and say, I'm going to adopt you and I'm going to raise you strong and you will be my child. And that's what I'm going for. So say this is a very worthy idea that has just been abandoned and receives very little attention, and just convince people, look, not only should it not have been abandoned, it's the right version of it, actually. So yeah, I figure I'll never write a book on any of my normal views because that book's already been written 100 times. You don't need me to write the book on The Sky is Blue. So I do always target ideas where I expect them to be controversial. Again, on the education one, that's probably the least controversial in that I can give an hour-long talk on that book, and for the first 45 minutes, I can get a totally normal audience to nod in agreement. And it's only after 45 minutes, when I get to minute 46 and I say, and that's why we should have less education, that people freak out.
That's amazing. That's amazing, because your theory is this is a negative sum game. Yeah. We're all jumping through hoops and we're wasting time. And then your implication is, let's just stop jumping through the hoops.
Yeah. And stop subsidizing hoop jumping. Stop having big government hoop jumping programs. Right. And again, that's where suddenly people have been saying, yeah, it was such a waste of time. I can't believe how little I learned. And then it's like, what's less of it? No, we can't have less of it. So that's what's striking to me is that immediately, so much of that book just fits with people's firsthand experience, that it's, there's only one or two people I've ever met who've actually said that your Case Against Education does not match my experience. It's always along the lines of, well, yeah, that seems to be everything that we've ever seen, but appearances are deceiving, and here's why.
Yeah. It's funny because you teach these people things, and then they don't even remember it when they're adults. So, and then you say, well, you teach them how to think, and then there's no evidence of that either.
Yeah.
And so the question
Well,
is,
I mean, I say that there's
doing
the evidence for people being taught how to think is that some people know how to think.
yeah.
So you can say, look, well, someone learned how to think at some point because some people do it. But what the actual experimental research is they can't find it in the lab. So I think I would just say it's just so rare that it's not experimentally detectable, although it obviously does get created somehow. But it's not a good rationale for what exists because what exists is so bad at getting people to learn how to think.
Do you think there's a diminishing returns to education in the sense that it might have been really helpful, 50, 100 years ago to increase the amount of education in the country? And maybe this is what the Flynn effect is reflecting, maybe not just nutrition, but some basic schooling. But we've gone way, way, way beyond what is optimal. Do you think that's right?
Maybe. Yeah. So I'll give that a maybe. It's complicated. You can see, again, like in macroeconomics, there is a lot of work on the question, what is the return for society from primary education, secondary, tertiary? And I would say probably the modal view is that primary is more important. But then there's other people saying no, and we don't really see it in the data. So that's one where I say in terms of measuring the economic payoff, it's plausible that it's more important to do the primary. The main reason for doubt actually is just to go and look at primary education and realize that our stereotype of what is happening at K through 6 is not most of what happens at K through 6. We picture K through 6 as just teaching literacy and numeracy. Yet if you actually go there, you'll see that most of the day they're spending on other stuff. And then it's like, well, that's odd. So like what kind of other stuff? Like music, art gets absorbed as a very large share of the day, actually. Right. And then realize, so if literacy and numeracy are very important and they're not doing nearly as much of it in K through 6, maybe a lot of it's happening later. I mean, it's a common complaint about modern college students that they arrive at college illiterate and innumerate, and then you sort of have to give them remedial education. Right. And so once you start thinking that way, it's like, well, maybe it's not actually such an issue of diminishing returns. And really, there's constant low returns. A lot of it driven by most of the day being completely wasted on material that people are not likely to use or remember or even learn in the first place.
Yeah, yeah. I think about my own experience. So when I went to grammar school, primary school, I went in with a very bad sort of speech impediment,
Oh,
and
really?
I used to pronounce words and phonemes in a very strange way. So like the sh sound sh. I used to do this weird thing, which I don't know if any other human has ever done, but I go. I used to do like that. I used to pronounce it from the sides of my teeth.
Yeah, so sorry, don't mean to laugh at what might be a very traumatic childhood memory.
Well, I didn't know. I didn't really know I was doing anything wrong, and every sound was sort of that ridiculous. I had found some weird way that no one else had pronounced the sound, and we had a speech pathologist who would like take students out and then like look at them and talk to them. And one of them was like, "Okay, you're going to start coming for lessons, once a week." And I didn't have any kind of it wasn't any kind of problem that couldn't be solved. As soon as she explained to me what exactly I needed to do with my mouth, I figured it out and I was able to do it. And that was huge. If I had never gone to public school, maybe I wouldn't, I'd still be sounding a little bit weird and people would think there was something off about me. But yeah, I mean, so I always thought that was huge. And then, but my pronunciation didn't really need the other 20 years of education that I've had. So the diminishing return story, is very plausible to me. And then you get things like algebra, things like reading, and then of course.
Yeah, I mean, it's so common also for defenders to ask, quote, to find one very useful thing and then say, and that's why we should fund education even more. And it's like, well, that might be a case for funding the exact thing you just told me about more. And we could probably fund it very, very comfortably, handsomely by cutting out all the things I'm complaining about. And that's, again, where like, no, we can't possibly think about that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, do you think, you're a big, fan of markets and accountability. How much of this problem is due to school just being basically a government monopoly with certain exceptions for, most of the last, century and a half or whatever?
Right. So ideologically, I'm really tempted to say that, but I don't think that really fits the facts. So if you look at private school curricula, they're extremely similar to public school curricula. So I don't think that there actually is much going on there. There are very important differences between private and public schools, and those have come out very strongly this year when private schools stayed open in person and provided the service people want to pay for, and public schools shut down and just took tax money to not do their job. So there are important differences between private and public education. And this is the year private education really showed its stuff. But in terms of the curriculum, I don't actually see very much difference between what they do. So I don't think that's so plausible. Again, I think the real story is that both public and private schools, people are primarily value them for the signal, for getting the credential, to get the stamp on your forehead. And private schools do try to compete with public schools by offering a better stamp, by saying, hey, we're going to give you a better credential, more prestigious credential. But I don't see that they put more time into hard subjects where you're actually building job skills. And again, from the point of view of parents, I can easily see them saying, well, so the main thing that we're looking for is the signal anyway. So like if you get the signal by doing a bunch of stuff that you don't need to know later in life, well, why should I worry about it? Again, I think that's probably a bit too sophisticated. I think most parents are just saying, well, this works. I don't know why. I don't need to know why. And then there's a lot of conformism, but main thing I notice, whenever I go to back to school night and the teachers go and talk about what they're doing, almost I look at the faces of the parents more than the teacher, just to see how they're reacting. And almost always I see the parents there smiling, happy, and saying, oh, yes, wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. And I'm the only one in the room saying, like, what is this garbage? Why are you doing this? Why does this class even exist? My reaction is quite out of the ordinary. So it doesn't seem like this particular failure is about public versus private, as far as I can tell, much as I would be sympathetic to that idea.
Yeah, that makes sense. Have you ever thought about how deep in human nature this goes? So a couple factors. I mean, first of all, we're not obviously the only country in the world that's adopted compulsory education. I think pretty much every country has done that, and a lot of countries have even higher rates of college attendance, and especially in some of the East Asian countries, they seem to massively overinvest, even beyond what we're investing in education. And I'm thinking about like religious communities. When I read about the ultra-Orthodox Jews and how they spend their days, and I was reading about, and once I read about what it takes to become an Ayatollah in Shia Islam. I don't know if it's like a 20-year curriculum. I mean, it's something ridiculous.
I'm impressed that there is a specific educational path towards becoming an Ayatollah. I would have thought you would have to actually form an organization, and
no, they have these seminaries where people. I mean, in Sunni Islam, I think you're basically. I think it's a lot more decentralized. But I think of the Shia Islam, there's these seminaries you go to, and then you sit there for 10, 20 years, and then it's like a super long PhD program, and you're studying everything about Islam that you could possibly study. And what is this about human nature? I mean, because it's analogous. It seems very analogous to what we're doing in public education and graduate school, university, all that stuff. What is it about human nature that just has people sit in rooms for a really long time, memorize information that is not very useful, and then give people status on that basis? Have you ever thought about what's going on there?
Yeah. So it can't be that deeply rooted in human nature, because it is something that emerged only in the past few centuries. It's something that more than a tiny share of people do. So, I think you need to say, well, the only story you could say is, well, when you combine human nature with being comfortable enough that you don't really need to have everybody working in order to survive, then maybe there's something more along these lines. Yeah. I would say that, of course, some of the things that I think are more deeply rooted in human nature. So just the love of children, and also the ability of people to demagogue based upon love of children. This I think probably is quite universal, right? So Darwin would make it very surprising if we didn't have a natural affection for children. And then once a demagogue comes along and says, "Hey, I can go and say, think of the children, and people will give me power," so that's going to be one path towards it. Although even there, I do think that if you think about it more historically, that there is this big wave of education that happens in Europe in the 19th century. And there seems to be a lot of just mutual imitation between European countries and countries in the Eurosphere. And then, of course, not too much, like around the same time, almost the whole world is colonized by Europe, which means they go and induct local elites into their education systems. And those local elites then standardly become the new rulers of the independent versions of the country. And while they may talk a lot about returning to indigenous customs and so on, in reality, they basically just reproduce what they learned in the colonial centers. So I think that's another thing that's going on. right? So, I mean, an analogy that I draw here is like why is that we see the support for education everywhere? So, you might think about it as like, why are the Abrahamic religions so dominant? And part of it is just history, right? So once you get the ball rolling, then it can keep rolling forever. And even if there's like the rock splits into two rocks, like with Christianity and Islam, still they basically just keep going along. So that's part of what's going on. But then you might also say the reason they've been so successful is the Abrahamic tradition does speak very deeply to human nature in some sense. So, it is striking how cultures that seem very distant from Christianity still have had major Christian movements, like the Taiping Rebellion in China, and like maybe the bloodiest war of the 19th century, although it's hard to get good estimates. And it all comes from some guy saying, "Hey, I'm the younger brother of Jesus, and let's start, and I should be ruling everyone, and let the bloodshed begin." And that lays China waste for decades. And so it's like, I mean, you'd think that they would just say, "This is a foreign religion, get out of here. Like, this is not Chinese." But instead, there's something about the religion that was able to go and animate a large segment of China to go and start a massive civil war there. So, I mean, it's as to what exactly it is puzzling, but just like another sign of just the strength of the Abrahamic tradition is the way that, even now you'll sometimes have a very secular intellectual, and then they have kids, and then suddenly they say, "Now, like Christianity, that's the way."
Yeah,
and it's like, really, like that doesn't fit with anything you've ever said or done before. But like, so now you have kids, and this isn't just like a game. You really believe this now?
Yeah.
So that I've encountered this several times, and I've been so confused, and yet obviously there's something about this tradition that really emotionally speaks to a lot of people in a way that I guess I'm just tone deaf to.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, I mean, when you talk about contingency versus sort of human nature or sort of laws of history or psychology, yeah, political scientists have these debates, and they look at like correlations between different nations, right? And then they say tends to be a trend. You get economically developed, you become a democracy, and then you have everything that goes with democracy, like gay rights and low birth rates, and whatever else, increasing education levels, and sort of what they draw from that is they have an explanation of how every step of the way, like, X causes Y. Well, I sit there and I say, these aren't, to find statistical significance, you need independent observations. These are not independent observations, right? They're usually, out there. It was like all this stuff is happening in the context of the Cold War, and then countries are just like becoming like America because that's sort of the model that they're following. And it's like the American culture is so dominant, and the IMF and the World Bank are telling you to do this stuff, and the U.S. is telling you to democratize. And I wrote this piece in China, a piece about China in Palladium, where I wrote that that led them astray and led them to think, well, this is just a law of history, so China is going to become democratic. Well, my view was, no, these countries sort of followed this pattern because they were just all working for the same template, right? There was nothing, or maybe something, a little bit of a truth to that, but you can't make the assumption just because you don't have independent observations. All you have is a bunch of stuff happening together, and all these countries are just influencing one another, right?
Right. So, I guess what always comes down to me is, all right, let's think about a bet. So, it seems much more plausible that China will become a democracy in the next century than that America will become a dictatorship. So I'd say there are these are what seem to be global patterns where you could say statistically you can't really get hardcore identification, and yet I'll still say it seems credible enough that I would put money on it anyway.
Yeah.
And then part of the point of these bets is to say it's not just me that will put money on this. I also can't find anyone that wants to put money on the other side. So it's not just me. This is basically what a bet reveals is not just what you think. It reveals that a lot of people agree with you, even when they're refusing, even when they say, "I don't agree with you." Yeah. So that's, like just by the theme of, actions speak louder than words, and a bet is an action, it's not just saying stuff. It's actually that. So, I can it's very plausibly that China will be an outlier, although again, still like 40% chance of multi-party democracy takes hold in China in the 21st century. That seems about as low as I could go.
Yeah. I would probably bet neither. I would bet that both systems sort of survive, as one is a democracy and one is the other. And probably, I think you're right, the second most likely scenario. But even with that, that would still be the bet. I mean, the bet is a way to get at it, but in this specific case, you're still working with the historical context of the U.S. and the ideas that were all in. You would need another Earth, and then have Nazi Germany or Germany win the war, First World War, and then see what happened to really understand if it's human nature. Although the bet can get in.
Yes. Although even then, we'd only be up to n=2, right? And you could say n=2. So we need to have 1,000 such worlds before we'll say it. Yeah. Honestly, like for me, a lot of this is coming from a philosophical Bayesian approach and saying, look, there's always prior probabilities that we start with. And then the point of social science is just to slightly tweak those priors. It's not to get an answer out of nothing. So again, sort of the classical statistics idea is we start off having no beliefs, and then we go and we have an estimator, and then that gives us a belief. And the Bayesian view is no, we start off with beliefs about everything. And then you see usually fairly low quality research, and then you very slightly tweak your belief up or down. So that's, honestly, a lot of that was motivating the case against education. I mean, so like the times that someone said, hey, there's one new paper out that shows you're wrong. And I'm just thinking like, one new paper cannot possibly show I'm wrong. like this is the paper that shows that Latin actually is useful in modern society. Like what is this paper possibly going to show along those lines? And then you realize, look, it's often it's a good paper. It's interesting. It provides a small amount of additional information, but all that it would do for a reasonable person is just ever so slightly tweak the probabilities. It wouldn't be the score settling, this is the final word paper that people so often like to pretend that it is. And especially this is where social scientists are, I think, probably the very worst in basically saying everyone should believe whatever the general model is that is supported by the latest high quality paper.
Yeah.
You just imagine the wild oscillations that would be required to actually follow that. But again, what really happens is that if the latest high quality paper supports what you already thought, then you wave it around, and otherwise you just go, So it's it is a classic heads I win, tails I break even kind of system.
Yeah. I was wondering how you think about these things, the education finding ethically. So the Open Borders book is sort of, I think you're looking at the world and you're saying, wow, the world could be so much better. We could help so many people. All we have to do is this one simple thing, and every objection you have, somebody can pay you off, and we could reach some kind of agreement, in theory. For the education book, I mean, does it just strike you as just like a major, human rights violation that we're doing this? I mean, even if it's like, even if it's 50-50 signaling versus, 50% of your life, of your first 20 years, you have 20 years if you go to college, and grad school has no social good at all. I mean, isn't this maddening? I mean, somebody was showing me data on young people having less wealth. And I said, okay, I mean, maybe some of this can be explained that they're just spending more years of their lives doing nothing. I mean, they're literally just sitting in desks and the period he showed me, it was like, under 30 adults. And, I looked it up, and they were getting like 2.5 more years of education since the time he was talking about. So like, if you look at your adult life from like 18 to 30, that could explain part of it, because that's like 1/5 of the time was just literally spent doing nothing. And this is just a small, wealth, but we're wasting massive amounts of human capital, people's time, and it's all for nothing. I mean, that's absolutely crazy. I mean, that this should be seen as a human rights issue, and not just in one country, but all over the world. I mean, isn't that nuts?
Well, let's see. I mean, but I say for K-12, I think it is the case that most people do want daycare for their kids.
Yeah.
So, if you really imagine taking kids that would have been doing something totally different, and then you drag them and put them in a school for 13 years, would seem like an enormous human rights violation. When you realize, look, their parents would be paying for something very similar to this either way, then you realize, all right, so it's not as bad as it seemed when you were a teenager. Because it's like, well, yes, I'm stuck here in this crummy school, but like the alternative would basically be to some other crummy school. In terms of it being, bad parenting, that's one that I'd be much more open to, and to say, look, why not send your kid to a school where they make him go and do the things that are actually going to be very important for him to know in the future, and then afterwards let him be a kid. So that's where because like I said, private schools are not very different in their curricula from public schools. So I would really criticize parents like they're sending their kids to school either way of have you looked at what your kid has to do? And I understand that literacy and numeracy are very important, and why you would want to make the kid do it even if he doesn't want to. But the other stuff, why are you forcing this child to go and dance if he doesn't like dancing? Right? So he'll come to learn. He'll come to love it, or maybe he'll hate it all the more. Right? So I mean, one of the themes of my kids' book is that while I'm not in principle opposed to parental paternalism and saying I know better than you, kid, but nevertheless, empirically, I see that very often when there's a disagreement between child and parent, the kid's right and the parent's wrong. Like, why do I have to do piano? I don't like piano. Like, I think the kid's almost always right in that scenario. Yeah. It's like, yeah, he's not going to become a musician either way, and he doesn't enjoy it. So why can't he have a childhood? Yeah. Now after that, I mean, I would say that it's very wasteful, but I would think of the main human rights violation as being of taxpayers who are forced to go and pay for this stuff, even though it's not delivering anything like the value that the proponents are claiming. For the students themselves, they say, college students are usually content, at least, maybe even having a great time. Mm-hmm. So it's a little odd to say that that's a big human rights violation for them. Again, you could always say there's a prisoner's dilemma, and basically you put them into a prisoner's dilemma where if they were to go and not attend, then that would really mess up their lives. I think that's a better complaint. So there's that. And then once you get back to grad students, yeah, maybe for them, they're pretty miserable overall. So your mileage may vary. So whenever people ask me about grad school, I always say, well, let me just start off with a really great thing about the George Mason Econ PhD. Our students are happy. We have happy students here who really enjoy what they're doing. Yeah. And this is not so at a lot of graduate programs. So when I was at Princeton, I would say most of the students were quite glum. Yeah. I mean, some of it was just I don't like doing this, and I mean the others was like, well, we have no hope of anything really good happening here. And I remember one of the glummest actually went on to become a full professor at a top 5 school. So in a way, I sort of want to throttle him and say, I don't listen to your whining, and now look at your job. And did you ever apologize for the whining? I don't think so.
Yeah, that's my experience too. I always figured, it's a very selected, a strangely self-selected group when you look at the people who are going to grad school, because they have college degrees. They're usually, pretty smart, and they've chosen 6 more years of poverty, right? Mm-hmm. For something with an uncertain payoff. And so why people do that is an interesting question. And some people, you think, well, they love truth. And when I look at academia, I don't see a lot of evidence for that hypothesis. So it seems to me they're looking for something else, right? Either they're afraid of going out in the world, or they just want a sort of lazier lifestyle, or they want the status that comes with academia.
I mean, for some jobs, the PhD is a union card. So you want to be a professor, you got to have that union card. So there's that. Yeah. For a lot of other ones, there's a glass ceiling if you don't have the PhD. Where they're like, I can never advance, so might as well I want to advance, might as well get it out of the way now. For humanities PhDs, I think you really just have to go down to they're deeply confused about what's really going on in the world. Yeah. Because even at very top schools, the odds of ever getting any kind of permanent teaching position are pretty slim in a lot of the humanities. So, and it's one where, say, do you understand how low your prospects are? Right. There is a great book on how to become a professor by Jason Brennan called Good Work If You Can Get It. And there he has all sorts of useful advice about how you can go and improve your odds of actually succeeding. But again, most of this is stuff that hardly anyone in grad school is following. Like you should start publishing today, right now. Why? Are you working on something for publication? If not, then you are choosing failure. Right. And he's very blunt about this. So I'm working on a paper for class, only write a paper for class that can be turned into a publishable paper. Yeah. Whatever you're doing, talk to the professor, can this become a publishable paper? So that's what you'd be doing if you really wanted to succeed. And again, it does seem like a lot of the people in the humanities are just sort of drifting through the path of least resistance. They don't really know what's going on. And I think by the time they're looking for a job, or actually looking for the job, they understand how hopeless it is. But if they would have started it, if they understood the sheer hopelessness of it, that's less clear. And then obviously you have things like CS where there's no big mystery about why people are doing it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was wondering how you think, as far as going back to the human rights issue. Yeah, I guess you're right. It is sort of sweet for the students, although our political discourse becomes confused because people then go, oh, look at these young people, they have no money, they must have no opportunities. But yeah, they're going to Club Med for 2-3 years and enjoying their lives.
Party is for what it is for a lot of students, and that's of course what students missed out on in last year is they didn't get to have the party.
Right. Yeah. And sometimes I see articles like in, like mostly conservative publications says, isn't grade inflation so terrible? And, kids are doing less homework. And I'm thinking, no, this is, if it's all signaling, like good for them to be doing less work. But you're right. But I think about the lost productivity to society, particularly smart people who are spending years and years in their prime.
Yes, or especially those who just get sidetracked into research on something of no broader relevance to society.
Yeah, exactly.
The amount of brain power spent on research that no one even reads, and even if you did read it, what difference would it really make?
I went to law school too, and I've published in a couple law review papers, and it's really awful there because law school, the top levels is basically just an IQ test. It's just the LSAT. And so you're getting smart people. They're 3 years. The only thing they don't teach you, they have classes on everything. The only thing they don't teach you is to take the bar. So kids have to take a class on taking the bar before they take the bar exam. So everything else in the world, feminism and the law, animal rights, whatever you want to teach, you'll have a class for that. Just not the one, literally one thing you need to be a lawyer. And these are smart people. If they were just, managers at some corporations making, the business a little more efficient, that would be, they're smart enough to be doing that, and they'd probably be doing a great job, and the world would be better. But that's not what they do. And you're so that's the policy sort of question. How have you sort of incorporated the ideas about signaling, about the wastefulness of education into your own teaching? So for me, I taught a class on game theory, and at UCLA, and one of the things we did, one of the lessons we were teaching was about the signaling model of education, to teach the concept of signaling more generally. It's funny because one girl didn't get it because she goes, "Oh, so what you're telling us with this is that we should all drop out of school and stop coming." I'm like,
no.
Like, you missed the point.
And once I gave the signaling lecture the day before holiday, and then someone reminded me, and I said, "Oh, if you hadn't reminded me, I would have thought the guys all listened and misunderstood me."
You all failed
the class, and there's no one there, huh?
So that's the wrong lesson. The lesson is society put you in this position where you have to be here and listen to me, which I hope you get some benefit from. But
so in terms of how it's affecting my own teaching, so I actually have two totally different teaching gigs. So I'm a college professor, but I'm also a homeschooling dad. So as homeschooling dad, my work has overwhelming effect on what I do. So basically, when I'm teaching my own kids, I say, okay, first of all, we're here to acquire a list of valuable skills. Right. And we're going to do that whether you like it or not. Secondly, we're here to go and learn things that you personally are interested in learning about because it's relevant to your future. And then third, if there's anything that you enjoy, we'll do that. And then finally, we're also going to go and try to crack the system and figure out all of the garbage that we can skip, and then filter through that and find what is the garbage that we can't skip if we're going to go to a decent college. So those are all the things that I do as a homeschooling teacher. So, like for my younger kids, like all we do really is math, reading, writing, right? And so the math is the one thing that I put a lot of effort into, and like every day we spend an hour going over math and math problems, and then the writing, so that. So just go and write about something, anything that you're interested in, just write about it. And then the reading, just read any book, anything you're interested in reading, just read about that. And other than that, for the younger kids, I don't have them do anything actually. So that's so I just say, I just want you to have a good childhood. We're going to.
At what age do you let them start doing things that they're more interested in? They go beyond the basics.
Pardon?
What you distinguish between older kids and younger kids?
Okay. So for the younger kids, like being younger, they're just less interested in non-play stuff. So if there were a younger kid that really wanted to learn CS or something like that, that'd be great. But that's not the kids I have. For older kids, that's where I'd be more focused on. Okay, so now we need to go and start getting our resume in order for college applications. And for some things, we can weasel out of them, and other things we can't weasel.
Yeah.
Right. And then there's a lot of I put a lot of thought into what can we weasel on, what can we not weasel on. So, for example, we mostly weaseled out of geometry. And I said, look, geometry, you only need to know the geometry that's on the SAT. All other geometry, we don't need to know. It's not cumulative. It doesn't really fit in with the rest of the math sequence. Whereas, say, like algebra 2, trigonometry, calculus, this is stuff that's all cumulative. And if you're doing anything in STEM, you've got to learn all this stuff. So that's stuff where we're going to just go forward right ahead. And then for, so like foreign language, I weighed that quite a bit. And I said, I just don't think we can use a lot of foreign language and still go to a good college. I mean, even if we get in, they'll still make you do it and it'll be harder to learn it at a later age. So we should just go and do this now. So anyway, that's what I do for my own kids, who I'll admit I love them a lot more than any of my other students, and I'm really racking my brain to make their childhood as good as it possibly can be while preparing them for the future. For the students that I actually teach as part of my paid job, there I would say the main thing that I do is if there's something that is that is standardly taught, but I think it's boring and not very insightful, doesn't really, not really very enlightening, then I quickly gloss over it. So, for example, I mean, I've been in most macro classes I've been in spend 2 or 3 weeks on national income and product accounting, and I do it in like 20 minutes. And I just look, here's the gist of it. Here's what you need to know. We don't need to know how depreciation works or anything else. It's like a measure of general production. Here's how you do it. And then I'd be much more likely to say, let's go and spend some time on what's wrong with the numbers, such as not counting leisure time. Right. Or I might say, like, what's wrong with like other things, like not properly accounting for changes in product quality, which means that we overstate inflation, which means that actually economic growth has been a lot higher than official numbers say. That's the kind of thing that I would spend a lot more time talking about, where it is directly relevant to something people actually care about, rather than the details of how the accounting methods, which hardly any student will ever use again. And if they learn it, they'll only learn it for the exam, and it won't enlighten them on any other issue. So there's that. Or like when I'm teaching PhD micro, I do general equilibrium in 1 week, whereas I think normal would be about 6 weeks. And I just say, look, I'm going to give you the highlights. This is not something that's really very useful or informative or enlightening. It's just something that you need to know because other people in our field also know it. So you need to understand what they're talking about, but we don't need to go into the details of it because it's just a giant distraction and signaling game. So there's that. On the other hand, I will say that part of it is I realize, look, this is signaling, and so one of the things I'm going to do is try to make sure that the good grades go to the students who actually did their job and learned the material, and bad grades go to the students that slacked off, so that at least employers can get an accurate measure of what they're getting when it's time to hire them.
Yeah. So yeah, same. I mean, same here. I think, yeah, I took a little bit more of a hands-off approach to teaching. I mean, once I really started taking the signaling model of, education seriously, it's not like the more stuff I can cram into their brain or the more hours of their lives I can take, the better they can get. I'm just giving them a relative grade. So, and the relative is, high, whatever, like whatever, the grade inflation is, whatever the mean is, I mean, it'll adjust, right? So like if people care about GPA, I'll just go with, whatever the standard is. It's not an absolute standard.
I mean, the main signaling critique of grade inflation is just that if there's too much grade inflation, then people have to get additional degrees afterwards in order to distinguish themselves, because obviously if everyone just got A's, then the only way to distinguish yourself would be to go and do yet another degree. So I mean, I've often said actually the best thing for signaling is to have high standards, strict standards, and where you just get flunked out, and then that's the end of it. Right. And I say that would be a good way of saving resources if we just say, look, you had your chance, you failed, and now you got to go on with your life.
Do employers? I mean, do employers for people just hiring people out of college actually look at GPA, or is that just?
So that's a good question. So like there is this whole field called industrial psychology where they measure things like this. Economists don't do much of it, but the industrial psychologists do. And I think that while there is some debate, I think the general view is that GPA is actually used by employers to probabilistically, again, primarily for initial hiring. So, when they don't know anything about you, when you have very little experience, then they'll look at multiple things. Of course, they'll look at the school you went to, look at your major, but also look at the coursework a bit, but GPA as well. So that would be factored in. I don't think that it's a GPA is going to be considered by employers 5 years out or anything like that. Yeah. But I mean, like the best way of thinking about most hiring is employers are looking for reasons to say no. So they have an enormous stack of people. They don't have anywhere near enough time in the day to interview them all. So basically step one is to throw out 80% of the applications. Yeah. And that's where I think GPA really matters. Yeah. It's a reason to throw you away.
Gotcha. The Yeah, let's move on to speaking of big ideas and important ideas that don't get their due. So your other book, Selfish Reasons to Have More Kids. I've looked through it. I didn't read it, like I said, because I'm familiar, pretty deeply with this research. But even the people who do the research and publish papers and books on it often don't talk about the important, I think, philosophical implications of this. I mean, often when you hear people say, why don't people have kids, even if whether just anecdotally or just when looking at like polling, they'll say stuff like we can't, people can't. They say they can't afford it.
Yeah.
And then you look at like countries by total fertility rate.
Yeah.
It's like, wow, Congo
Yeah.
and Niger must be living it up there. I mean, they can afford it. Must be much better places to live than Hong Kong and Singapore. And so, yeah, the behavioral genetics literature I think is just so fascinating because I think this stuff should be fundamental. I mean, every social science basically deals with how can you change people to some extent. I mean, not every social science, but there's a part of this in economics, there's part of this political science, sociology, and you need to know what percentage of what you can change is actually changeable, right? You need to have some kind of idea of that. And if it's, the blank slate model, then there's a lot for social science to do. If it's more leans towards genetic determinism, there's maybe less for social science and, policy to do. So I think, just for being philosophically interesting, I think this is just so basic and yet it goes ignored. Do you have any thoughts on that? Just like, people not taking the ideas, the lessons of behavioral genetics seriously?
Yeah, so I've got a lot to say about that actually. So, I mean, most of this behavioral genetics research, in fact, like virtually all of it, is produced by people who are professors, and their goal is to go and get a paper published in some journal and then move on with their lives. Like, so, almost no one that's doing this work is actually interested in doing anything with it. Actually,
Yeah.
This is not limited just to behavioral genetics. I also found this in education research where a number of papers saying, oh, we found this thing in education. Okay, now moving on. And like the idea that anything might ever change based upon the research is just, again, it's not that the world doesn't listen. It's that the people that produce the research barely make any effort to even communicate that their findings or try to sell anyone on what they're doing. So, you publish a piece on the behavioral genetics of teeth, and then you say, all right, I'm done. I'm published in the Journal of Genetic Dentistry, and now I'm moving on with my life. So a lot of what I wanted to do in this book was to put the research together in a way where people could see the big picture and see how you might actually change the way that you live. Now, I know that, as you're mentioning, Judith Harris's book, The Nurture Assumption, was filling a very similar niche. What was striking about that book to me is that she focused almost entirely on the behavioral genetics of personality. And there, I think there is a very natural reply to this and say, well, look, parents don't matter much for personality because they're not trying to affect personality very much. Personality is the kind of thing that parents know one should respect and just treat as a tree that just grows in its own special way. And it's not the parent's place to try to go and say what the tree does. And so I think people could reasonably say, look, Harith finds that upbringing is very important because she's studying the parts of upbringing where parents are not, or they're studying the adult traits that parents are not really trying to change. So what I did is I tried to just cast a much broader net and find all sorts of adult traits that parents are clearly trying to change, like your educational success or your income or your church attendance, these things. And that's where I said, like Harris's results are actually very, that she was reporting are very general. And that actually, even for all of these things where parents clearly, desperately are wanting and trying hard to make a difference, we don't see very much effect. Now, the way that you were interpreting it, I think, is not quite right in that even if you go and get a heritability estimate of 100%, this does not actually show that you cannot change the child. It just shows that within the observed range of what parents actually do, none of the variation in that changes kids. But it always remains possible that there's something else that could be done that would make a very big difference. Yeah. And then the question is, like, okay, what would that thing actually be? Now, a hope I think that people have is that there's just a bunch of magic bullets where you just give them Wheaties every third Wednesday, and then they will become a Nobel Prize winner. And it's like, well, then why have we found it? Because no one's doing this exact specific thing. But if we did it, like this tiny little intervention would dramatically change life. Now, I think almost no one really believes in these magic bullets. So then what's the other alternative? The other alternative is to say, look, if we want to go and get this effect, either we're going to have to drastically ramp up the effort, or maybe just once we realize how much effort it would take, we give up. So, one of my favorite examples here is foreign language acquisition. So this overlaps with both education and child rearing. So if you go and look at a representative survey of adult Americans, less than 1% even claim to have learned to speak a foreign language very well in school. So it's like less than 1%. All right, claim just so that who've learned it, and people would tend to exaggerate that. So now, from that you could have two reactions. One reaction is, well, in that case, let's go and try a lot harder so they actually do learn the foreign language. On the other hand, you could say, well, apparently it's it's too hard. So for that, what you really want to do is say, well, how hard are we trying right now? All right. So how hard we're trying right now is basically that you do minimum of 2 years, more often 3 years if you're going to college, a foreign language. And once you realize you're already spending 3 years of life on it, to say we should do a lot more seems, to my mind, is pretty crazy.
Yeah.
So what, we're going to spend 10 years on this thing? And maybe that probably even that wouldn't be enough. Now, is for my older homeschool kids, I said, I just don't think we can weasel out a foreign language and go to a good college. So, they actually did, acquire genuine Spanish fluency, right, through homeschooling. And not, this is one where I had to hire other tutors and so on, because I can't do it. I went to regular school, so I don't speak Spanish. I just had 3 years of crummy public school and Spanish education. Yeah. But even with my kids and getting special tutors and doing college Spanish, even that wouldn't have been nearly enough, except that they started speaking only Spanish to each other. Mm-hmm. So I would say they probably put in about 50 times as much effort as a normal kid would into this, and that was enough.
Yeah.
Okay, that did it. That did the trick. So what this means is that this is changeable. It can be done. The real question is just, does it make sense to put 50 times as much effort into this thing where my sons really enjoy Spanish now, but even they will say, yeah, as to what I would exactly do with it is kind of unclear, but I don't know, improves your dating pool or whatever, but
yeah. It's, I think you're right that I didn't mean to imply that you can't change the world through policy or effort,
right?
Because you look at things that have changed,
or kids, right? Heritability estimates do not mean that kids are unchangeable. It means that you don't see much sign that existing parenting changes them. So it's doesn't versus can't. Parenting doesn't matter much. Can't is a harder judgment, although it does mean you have to look in the mirror and say, either I know some magic tricks of parenting that are low cost but incredibly effective, or I am so unusual, so I'm so out of the norm, I'm going to do something that one person in 10,000 does.
Well, and then Bryan Caplan might be one person in 10,000, right?
Yeah. I'm going to stick my neck out and say, I think I did give my older kids a 1 in 10,000 educational experience for middle school and high school. They were taking AP tests in 7th grade and doing college classes when they were 12. So that's pretty weird. And I think we see some effects of that. Of course, you can always say it would have happened anyway.
Yeah.
At minimum, I say it would have happened later.
Yeah. Well, I think if you're a good social scientist and you deal with big issues, which I think, that's the way you think of yourself. That's why I think of you. I think that's gotta have some effect. Now, how many people are data driven and are giving their kids to the truth about the world? So once you've given somebody that, I think that could be valuable. It wouldn't show up in cross adoption studies because 99% of people are just normal and they have normal views and normal interests and normal
and just normal commitment. So I think of myself as a very obsessive person. Once I get into something, I really get into it. That can be bad for you if you're focused on something that is a waste of time. On the other hand, it also means that when you apply yourself in a good direction, you are much more likely than other people to finally get some results out of it. Mm-hmm. So that's been a big part of working with my kids is what are things that are worthwhile really putting a lot of effort into. I also try to get feedback from my kids about, does this seem valuable to you? Is this something you want to pursue further? And if they say no, it's all right, well, I guess you don't really need this, so we can just move on.
Have you gotten a lot of emails or letters or whatever from people who read Selfish Reasons to Have More Kids and actually decided to have more kids? Has that been a rewarding?
Yeah. So I have actually, and probably out of all the stuff that I've actually accomplished in the real world, it's the most gratifying. It's the biggest deal. So I actually have this idea of the poll where the audience is highly self-selected and yet still the answer is informative. And There is such a poll. So if you do a poll saying, "Did Bryan convince you to have another child?" All right. Now, on the one hand, it's going to be a very self-selected number of people will respond to that. But if the total number of people say yes is 100 people, it's like, well, so that probably is a bare minimum of the actual number that I changed the minds of. So you basically like self-selected polls where the goal is just to count the minimum of something in the world. That's I think that's pretty useful. So there's actually a YouTube video of a guy and his daughter, and he's having her thank me for convincing him to have her.
Yeah.
So I subsequently actually met the guy, but so anyway, it's like a message from beyond the grave, or it's a message from oblivion, from never would have been. So yeah, it's like in terms of getting a swelled ego, it's like my words create life. So yeah, I think that total number of people that have at least said so on the internet. I think it's over 100 people have said they've been convinced by me to have at least one additional kid. So if you just put in like a standard value of life calculation, that's like over $1 billion worth of value that I've created. So I don't capture it, but still, it's my gift to the world.
Yeah, it was the behavioral genetics literature. Did have that effect on me. Were you originally influenced in that way to make family a priority?
So there was basically a double whammy for me. So I read The Nurture Assumption before I was a parent. But then my first two kids were identical twins, and having them was a daily reminder. Like, you are the kinds of people study to find out how people turn out, or why people turn out the way that people do. Right. So like having them around, it really just put it on my mind a lot more than it otherwise would have been. And that's very plausible to me anyway. That is, I wouldn't have written the book if I didn't happen to have identical twins as my first two kids. Right. And then, like in writing that, that book, I had my third son, and then we had my fourth child a few years after that. But yeah, that was so like in the end, it made a big difference in my life, but it was complicated in that, when I don't think it had influenced me when we were first trying, but it was sort of this coincidence that we had identical twins. And then that just made me much more conscious of the research and more interested to learn more.
Yeah, and I think that the basic argument is that it's a lot funner and not as hard as you think, or at least it doesn't have to be as hard as you think.
Yeah, this is the self-imposed misery is what is so clear to me. Because look, I'm just going to be honest, and I'll say like I've known a lot of parents of young kids, and most of them seem less happy by quite a bit than they did before they had the kids. Yeah. All right, and look, that's just honest. And people say, well, that totally cuts against your thesis. I say, no, my thesis is that parents are needlessly making themselves miserable. Yeah. So they can have the kids and still have a very nice life, but they are making a bad trade-off based upon a misunderstanding of the science. So I say, look, don't blame the kids, blame the misconceptions about the science of nature and nurture. I said, basically, I've said parents being unhappy, or at least less happy than otherwise similar single people. Not only does it not contradict my thesis, it motivates the entire book. Right. So if parents were already super happy, then you'd say, well, why do they need you? But on the other hand, it's if they're unhappy and they say, I can show you a happier path. Yeah. That's where there's really some value to offer.
And it connects so nicely to the case against education, because one of the things makes people nervous and drives people crazy is finding the right schools and affording the right schools. And I was reading, I don't know if you saw, did you see the Bari Weiss piece in City Journal, I think it was, or one of those websites, or where she talks about this school of, the angle is that there's this woke elementary school, and the parents are unhappy because they're teaching them, critical race theory and all this kind of stuff. And, the parents are paying $55,000 a year. And I'm like, your headline is, wow, these poor people are being brainwashed. And I'm reading this. I'm like, what on earth are they doing? They're voluntarily paying for this. And they hate the curriculum on top of it. So what on earth are they doing? That's the interesting part to me, not specifics of the curriculum.
All based on a testable theory that this will lead to a large improvement in their kids' prospects in the future. And almost all the research says it'll be somewhere between zero and small. So yeah, it's pretty crazy.
Do you think the resistance to these ideas both about the behavioral genetics and the limited influence of education on people's personality. I mean, they're basically the same thing, right? Because they're both basically saying there's a limit to what parenting can do. There's a limit to what schools can do to make people, smarter or better somehow in life. Um, is the resistance to that people just want, they have a sort of a utopian idea. It's got to be either parents or it's got to be school. There's got to be some way we got to remove these equalities and just make people better. And they don't like these big obvious truths because it just contradicts that that entire narrative and makes it seem impossible or very, very difficult.
Yeah, so definitely ugly truths are unpopular, right? And they're so unpopular that a lot of people don't even feel comfortable hearing them, much less saying them, right? So just say, look, some kids are a lot smarter than others. Some kids are really stupid. Like, you're never going to make friends saying that, and yet, obviously, right? Anyone who's gone to school knows that there's just stupid kids.
Yeah.
Of course, and say, no, there's no such thing as a stupid kid. It's just a kid where you go and found the right way of teaching them. Look, almost by definition, a stupid person is someone who fails to learn when you through a wide variety of different methods, and they still don't learn it, or they learn it very slowly. That's what it is to be stupid. Right. And that's just a fact of the world. Is it doesn't mean to go around telling people, you're stupid, but also means don't base policy upon a sugar-coated view of how the world actually works.
Yeah.
So, right. And just realize you can end up treating people very cruelly when you don't face facts. So keep trying to go and make someone spend ever more years in school when they're just not academically oriented. Which could be personality as well. There's a lot of people who are quite bright who just hate school because it's just so boring, and you're not really, and they don't feel, and they're doers, right? So people like you and me are people who just like toying with ideas. A lot of people find this painful, and they'd much rather put a ship in a bottle today than than go and read some articles. So there's just a lot of people who like actually rolling up their sleeves and doing things, and school is very hard, very just unpleasant for them, and very hard for them to cope.
Yeah.
And then the ugly truth that a lot of what you're learning in school is irrelevant in real life. You'll never need to know it again. Well, that's ugly truth that students forget most of what they learn after final exam because it's not so very relevant. These are all things that people really don't like hearing. And then again, for kids, this is one where I think there's also a lot of sunk cost fallacy going on, where once a parent has suffered a lot, they want to hear it was worthwhile. Now, if this is right, then if I can get people before they actually sunk any investment in, then they'll be more persuadable. There's other theories that would predict that they're younger then, so they're more persuadable then too. But it's at least plausible to me that if I could get to people before they've really suffered a lot, that they will be, that they would actually then say, fine, there's a lot of parts of parenting that I'll just skip because they're not very fun and aren't really beneficial to the child either. So there's that.
Yeah. I mean, I like ideas as an adult. As a kid, I sort of liked ideas too. But I think I had a different experience from a lot of smart people. And my parents were immigrants, and I went to a more lower class school where the kids were on average. Here's another ugly truth: not as smart as people who grew up in high socioeconomic status areas. And it was the class. So the class, sort of the progress of schooling was very, very slow. Which drove me absolutely crazy. And then it was also the culture of the other kids was, they sort of made fun of you if you had any intellectual interests.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So for a while, I was both tortured in school because it was so slow and boring, and then sort of got it into my idea for a while that it was uncool to actually go out and try to do stuff on my own. It was just a horrible experience for me. Actually, I read there's a Scott Alexander post where he apparently felt the same way and has a lot of feedback from his readers. And they talk about just sort of the prison-like atmosphere they felt. And one of the things I like about you talk about is it that bad of a human rights violation? I think in the I think for some people it is really, really bad. And what you would have in a more, a system of norms where, people just sort of had a more individualized, more market-based approach, is that the kids who just find it torture to just sit there and do nothing or are just not getting anything out of it, their parents would realize that. I know you say the private school is not that different, but the private school at least is very, segregated by economics and, sometimes ability and all these other things. So I think one of the things that was particularly bad for me from the public school was the fact that, there was these just kids of different backgrounds and different.
The mixing. Right. There's been research on whether tracking actually improves student performance. And so, even if it doesn't, still, like just like getting a kid who's suffering from the slow pace of his peers and letting him be in a class where he's not so miserable. There's some value to that. So, like it doesn't just have to be the improving learning. It could also just be the quality of life of the student. Which, I mean, I say that there's like one general theme, for both the kids and the education book is just a great discounting of the feelings of the child.
Yeah.
Right. And just really, you're in K through 12, it's 13 years. It's a very large share of your life. And just say, who cares whether you're miserable for those 13 years? It's like, why wouldn't you care? It seems important. Right. So, and generally, this is, one of a number of cases where when people criticize, they would rather say, well, there's some long run problem, which is totally debatable, rather than some short run cost, which is totally clear. So, people would rather say things like, K through 12 is, could cause anxiety in adulthood than just to say like kids aren't happy right now.
Yeah. Yeah. Even if you get over it. Yeah, you're absolutely right. If you're an adult till you're 18, I mean, that's a huge portion. That's a huge portion of your life, or the kids, interest not to be considered at all. It's pretty crazy. Yeah. You might not hurt your anxiety as an adult, but if you're spending 12 years anxious, 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, that's pretty bad. Okay, great. I mean, I love these. I love these topics. I think they're important. And the other one is, I think we could just talk about a little bit about Open Borders, and it's different than the other book because it's sort of a comic book, right?
Yeah. So it's a nonfiction graphic novel, which is the actual term in the business. It's a little confusing because you think of novels as by definition being fiction, although even that is not true. So Truman Capote's In Cold Blood was billed as a nonfiction novel, so anyway, I mean, I'd read a number of books like this, and some are good, some are bad, but the good ones were really good. So, for example, Larry Gonick's Cartoon History of the Universe, 5 volumes where he takes you through the totality of human history. And I found that not only was it just by combining words and pictures, conveyed more information per minute's time. By being more entertaining, it got you reading for a larger number of minutes. And then finally, notice that it can be very accurate. You can carefully fact check a work like this. So, like any area of human history that I knew well, Gonick seemed to be very accurate. So, I had the idea of what if I were to go and do a book like this, where I take research on immigration and just try to present it in a more engaging format, and both communicate more per minute, but get people reading for a larger amount of time. And also, just for me, it was just a fun thing to do. So, I'm not able to actually draw, but I do think visually. So I fully storyboarded these books using some old comics book software and Google Images, and then wrote the script. And then I was able to find my dream illustrator, Zach Wienersmith, who does Saturday Morning Breakfast Cereal. So that was just a dream come true that I got Zach to collaborate with me on that book.
Have you seen the there was a post, I forget who wrote this, but it was a blog somewhere. It said the case against books. Have you seen this?
Maybe was it Matt Iglesias or?
No, I don't think it wasn't Iglesias. Maybe.
Okay, yeah. Well, so Matt Iglesias had this review of Open Borders where he said, "Yeah, really, there's no reason to do anything other than books like this for educating a broader audience on public policy. Like, why do we write? Who imagines that a normal person would ever read any policy book? Yeah. Better to just hand them a comic book that summarizes the information in a more entertaining fashion." But I guess I don't know the case against books then.
Yeah, and I know you. I know you. I mean, I know you deal with this in the book, but the question of I think the one some things you say in the Open Borders book are undeniable. Like if you do a cost benefit and you consider every relevant actor, that includes the people who live in the country and the people who want to immigrate to the United States in this case, I think you get I think the benefits of migration are clearly positive. I think you're also dealing at the same time when you try to address this, and some people just don't care. They don't want to take the interests of every relevant actor into account. They only want to care about the country itself. And your answer to that is, look, no matter how bad you think the effects are, the benefit to the migrants are so large that there could be some deal worked out, right? Is that sort of the animating spirit?
Well, so that's sort of my second line of defense. My first line of defense is that in all of economic history, it is not possible to find any example of a very large increase in production that was not broadly beneficial.
Right.
So if you just look anywhere, again, of course, sometimes there is a very specific innovation that's not broadly beneficial, but anytime there is some broad increase in productivity, it is just an iron law of economics that through the price mechanism, a lot of the benefit winds up getting shared with other people. So the main beneficiaries of the vaccine are not the people who made the vaccine. Like, obviously,
Yeah.
right? They're lucky to capture 1% of the value that they created, and the rest of it gets shared with us. And we just get to enjoy it as consumer surplus. And same with the Industrial Revolution, same with the internet. So if you just go down the list of large increases in production, I say there's no example where it wasn't broadly beneficial. And so I say, since the key economic argument for open borders is that it lets labor move from places where there's low productivity to places where there's high productivity, we should totally expect that large increase in production to be broadly shared as well. But again, if you just look at what immigrants do, so immigrants move to a town and they open restaurants, and then a restaurant's just something that benefits people who work in the restaurants or own the restaurants. No, like, all the people who eat there get to enjoy the food, right? So, and again, the same goes for anything that immigrants wind up doing is to sell the product, they have to put it on the market. When there's a large increase in supply, prices go down and it gets shared with a very broad population. So that is my main point, is actually that you shouldn't think about the legal incidents as being the same as the economic incidents. Flip side of this is there could be terrible weather, which is actually great for orange farmers because it raises the world price of oranges so much. Mm-hmm. So you look at it and say, those poor farmers, half their crops been destroyed. It's like, no, those lucky farmers, because through the price mechanism, they're making more money than before because demand is inelastic. All right. So that is, I say, like, the big thing to focus on. But then second thing is what you say, that even if it were true that immigrants were getting the lion's share of the benefits, or that actually natives were losing and foreigners were winning, then yes, standard economic policy says, let's make a deal. Let's go and figure out a way to go and transfer some resources from the winners to the losers, so the losers become winners. Right. And obvious thing is, you work here, but you have to pay extra taxes, or you can work here, but you have to pay an entrance fee. Right. And or you can work here, but you're not eligible for benefits, or there's some limitation on benefits. These are all pretty obvious deals you could offer. And it is worth pointing out that the countries on earth that have the very highest foreign-born shares, none of them actually treat immigrants like they are treated in the first world. So basically, the Gulf monarchies are the countries that are notorious for treating migrants poorly, especially low-skilled migrants. And they also have the largest foreign-born shares on earth by far.
Yeah.
So like Kuwait would be like 85% foreign-born. And if you're saying what's going on here, well, it's no coincidence. The Gulf monarchies, they let in low-skilled workers on purpose. It's not just the low-skilled workers sneak in and they say, we don't have the heart to kick them out. They let them in and they say, yeah, well, we have some low-skilled work we want you guys to do. We want janitors. We want nannies. We want people to work in construction. And guess what? You're not going to be eligible for any welfare, and there's going to be a deposit that you're going to have to pay, and a bunch of other restrictions, and you're not allowed to do a bunch of things that regular citizens can do. And then you still see a ton of people want to do it because they make 5 times as much money in Kuwait as they would back home in Pakistan. Yeah. Right. So, and again, like all the countries with very high shares of foreign-born shares, they all have a lot of restrictions like this. And Singapore, which is the one that's closest to being Western democracy, they also have a lot of restrictions, and I think they're at like 40% foreign-born, so they're not anywhere near Kuwait, but still very high. And again, the story's pretty obvious that if you feel like you have to treat every immigrant like an honored guest, then you don't really want to have a lot of guests. On the other hand, if you treat them like the hired help, then it's like, hey, hired help. I like hired help. So that is the difference. And and again, like, so much of this just comes down to this immature squeamishness of, I feel so sorry for them if I let them in and they weren't able to get the same benefits as everyone else. So let's not have them come, so I don't have to look at them and feel sorry for them. Yeah. Right. So, wow, you're quite a humanitarian there. You're going to ruin someone's life so you don't have to look at their misery. Great. Thanks a lot. Yeah. I have this slogan where I say, like, pay them the common courtesy of not caring about them. Yeah. That would be so much better than what you're doing.
Yeah, that's interesting. So yeah, I just Googled Kuwait. Yeah, Kuwait foreign-born percentage is 75%.
75. Okay, so I'm a little high, but
and then Qatar is actually higher. Qatar, as they say, is 65. I see 65 in Qatar, and who knows? This is the first thing that comes up in Google. 88% UAE. So we're talking about.
Oh, okay, yeah. So I was probably mixing up UAE and Kuwait. So
yeah,
but my bad. But thank you for fact checking me, Richard. Keeps me honest. Yeah. Someone's gonna have to. Number of times I tell my students, okay, I think I remember this, but then normally they just take it as gospel, even though I have given the disclaimer of I'm just doing it from memory.
Look, the fact check is a website called statista.com. So I don't know. someone is going to have to fact check that fact check. I don't know if that's accurate, but they tend to have numbers for everything. Yeah, it's funny because I think if you asked probably the right or the left, like if you gave them a bunch of policy options, I think somehow yours would be last place for all of them. Maybe the right would take that over just open borders with full citizenship, right? So I think it would be probably close to second to last for the right, and for the left, I mean, I think that would be worse. I think that would be actually worst for them.
Yeah, I mean, just for a typical person, and it's like people again don't like ugly truths and things that sound good, sound bad, but are good. People don't want them.
Yeah, I mean, do you think? I mean, but is the infeasibility of it an argument against your case? Because when you do selfish reasons to have more kids, maybe you can convince people it's in their own interest, and you're sort of working with human nature there, and so you might get it. With this, you're just going against sort of every value people currently hold, and so is that an argument against just this is a nice thought experiment, but just not realistic?
Right. Well, so like in one sense, it's realistic. Like if we wanted to do it, we could totally do it.
Yeah.
Like I don't have illusions about how persuasive I am. I don't think that by going and defending something really unpopular that I'm going to transform our society or anything like that. Say like as to why I do it. So like partly I am an academic, and just the search for truth means a lot to me. Partly by personality, I just don't enjoy going and proposing marginal changes. I like going and talking about like what would actually be the best thing we could possibly do. So there's that. But then partly I say also just by going and making the strongest case for what I think is the best policy, I think it does disarm the criticism and at least make people at the margin more willing to consider more moderate reform. So I think there's probably people can read open borders, and if they ever have a position to decide immigration policy, I think it does at least steal them towards let's err on the side of having more immigration. In terms of it really being feasible, I'd say, well, the fact that Gulf monarchies do it, I mean, it can be done, right? It's, it is doable, right? And so, so much of the reason why it's not done is just that people have some bad arguments against it. So, I get some value there. But, just had to remember, I'm just one person. I can't realistically expect to get results on anything, actually. So I just try to do a good job and to defend positions that I think are neglected and worthwhile.
Do you think that you might be underestimating your influence because I feel like the Overton window on this issue has shifted, and I think if someone was a Bryan Caplan, and if there was a disciple of Bryan Caplan and then on this issue, I think what they wouldn't do is run for office and say, I'm for open borders. I think they would run for office maybe as a liberal Democrat or just some kind of normal person, and then pretty much act as a open borders person, right? So the fact that nobody is saying in the political realm open borders is not an indication. It's sort of like in the other direction. I think a lot of the motivation for immigration restriction is actually white nationalism, and very few people are open white nationalists in politics, but I know there are some, quasi white nationalists who are motivated by that, but then they'll talk about jobs or they'll talk about whatever. And I figure there must be, the extremes are influencing people on both sides, and I think you probably are influencing. Do you think that like watching the political debate that there is sort of, you could see a hint of this? Because I think 10, 15 years ago, I think the way we talk about undocumented migrants, they were basically talked about like criminals, 2 decades ago, and that on the left really doesn't fly. Even on the right, it's not as harsh. It's like you have to portray as many of them as possible as criminals or smugglers.
Because if they're criminals for another reason.
Nobody's angry at just the normal people anymore. And so, do you think maybe you actually have had an influence in that way?
Yeah. So the idea that more radical views on immigration are covertly affecting what actually happens, I think that's plausible. What doesn't seem very plausible to me is that I personally am the marginal factor. So I'd say I'm one voice out of a bunch of people that are defending much higher levels of immigration. So, and again, just looking at what other people say, it seems to me like most of the time when I talk to people who are immigration activists, they barely ever thought about open borders or anything like it, and their focus is really almost entirely on people who are already here. Right, who I would say that's the problem that is so minor compared to all the people that haven't gotten here in the first place. So, I mean, I do definitely love the idea of people secretly waving my book around and saying, this is our whole agenda here. I just have trouble believing that it's happening very often. Right. I mean, honestly, my guess is actually that I'm more influential among right wingers. So the pro immigration Republican, which is, not an oxymoron. Right. And actually, if you look at what happened under Trump, I would say it is the so-called business Republicans who did prevent there from being any major change in immigration law. Right. And so these are the people that are very closely allied to businesses in their districts. And a lot of those businesses employ a lot of illegal immigrants. And at minimum, they just want to let's not do anything about this. Let's just not hassle my allies. Right. So I think that they are more likely to actually been influenced by what I'm doing than liberal Democrats who, so I'm always happy to go and have people who disagree with me and other things read me. But there is this sociology of people tend to read things by people that are read by people who read things that are like things that are read by other people and so on. So I think that my social distance from the right is probably considerably smaller than from the left, even if I'm saying something much more radical that, that still the buffers between me and Republicans, I would think, are probably just milder.
Yeah.
But again, I could be wrong about that. I mean, so often it's just confusing as to what's going on in the real world, and especially about oneself. One is very confused. It's like the number, there's so much selection bias among the people that that talk to you about yourself, and even they don't generally just tell you exactly what they don't level with you very often. So, whenever someone says, what your problem is, Bryan, I'm always intrigued. Oh, please tell me. No one tells me what my problem is. I'd really like to know, just to get any feedback at all on the nature of my problem or problems. So hit me with it.
Well, I think you're right that you're known as a free market guy who violates some taboos. So I think I think your social distance to the right is closer. Although on the left, I've seen an uptick in this kind of rhetoric, and I don't know of, and maybe this is just my own bubble, I don't know of many people just making the full open borders case on the left, but somehow the arguments have gone there. So there was a famous interview with somebody at Vox and Bernie Sanders years ago.
Yeah.
And then Sanders.
So it was some of the Vox people there. I actually know them personally. So then, if you were to say I've had some influence there, I would say I can definitely believe that because a few of them have been in my house. So that makes sense.
But then the next time, I think it was the next time Sanders ran, he became not an open borders guy, but he got in line basically from where the problem. And maybe this is probably the woke more than Bryan Caplan, who more open immigration, but there was a move at least in that direction. Yeah, it's interesting. Proving the influence of any one person is always hard, but you do see these policy discussions shift. So somebody making arguments must be having an effect somewhere. Tracing it.
I say my social distance to effective altruism, that's much closer. So there, I know a lot of people involved in that very well.
Yeah.
So I can believe, I can believe that I've got a lot of influence there, but then as to how much influence effective altruism has, it's noticeable in the world, but it's a small share of philanthropy, which is of course a small share of GDP. So, it's what they're doing is great, but it's not. I don't see much sign that that it leads to fundamental social. There's led to any fundamental social change yet, and little hard to believe it will ever, but maybe prove me wrong, effective altruists. I'll be the first to say I'm so glad I was wrong.
Right. Yeah. So this was fun, Bryan. Are you working on anything now? What's your next?
Yeah. So I've got 2 books. So actually, the thing that I'm working on right now is I'm doing another graphic novel on housing deregulation.
Oh, fun.
So it's called Build Baby Build: The Science and Ethics of Housing. Yeah. And it's going to be a similar to Open Borders in that I'm going to take a lot of high quality research that hardly anyone cares about or knows about and put it together in a package that convinces people that it's actually really important and would make an enormous difference in our society. So actually, I have a chapter in there in the book called The Panacea Policy, where I say, if we could deregulate housing, this wouldn't just go and lead to a big improvement in the housing situation. It would actually make a major dent in a long list of other problems people are complaining about. So, it comes down to, housing is about 20% of the average American's budget. And a very reasonable back of the envelope estimate is that full deregulation of housing would cut the price by 50%. So you're talking about cutting the cost of living by 10%, raising the standard of living by 11%, right? 1 over zero point 0.9. And then there's also research saying that on top of this, we get another big bonus, which is that currently people don't move to areas with high total factor productivity because the cost of living is too high, and this deregulation would make a big difference there. So we can squeeze out another big burst of productivity out of that. So again, I say it's very reasonable to think that this deregulation could raise US GDP by 25%. And then I go over all of the other problems that addresses. So inequality, so much of inequality turns out is just driven by housing, right? So, like the rising capital share that Piketty is famous for finding. There's a very well-known paper that shows it all comes down to rising housing cost. And if housing cost had stayed where it was, then there would have been no increase in capital share since World War II, right? And then, of course, for general inequality, obviously, the poor are spend a larger share of their income on housing and are more likely to be renters. So 2 reasons why the poor would get an especially large share of the gains from housing deregulation. Makes a big difference for mobility. So because, like in the past, it was totally normal for the poor in the United States to move to rich areas of the country to improve their standard of living. And there's this great paper by Ganong and Shoag showing that nowadays, while high-skilled people can still make money by moving to rich areas of the country, low-skilled areas will actually lose money if they move to high-paid areas of the country because the housing costs will get more than 100% of the wage gain. So we got that. I talk about how reducing housing costs would make a big difference for fertility because it is not fun to try to raise 5 kids in a one-bedroom apartment, right? And and of course, in terms of also getting family formation started at an earlier age would make a difference there too. Let's see. And there's a bunch of other things that we get out of housing deregulation. So, and again, as far as a graphic novel, a lot of what I want to do is to show people what they're missing, like actually visually show them the fantastic visionary cities that we could have if we would just go and become more flexible about this, right? And again, it's like, my view here is, well, a normal view among economists is that this is all problem caused by homeowners protecting the value of their investment. And I actually say that the distributional effects of the regulation are much less clear. First of all, even if you are a homeowner, you might like to have a bigger home than you've got. And in that case, if the price of homes were to fall, the net effect on your welfare is actually ambiguous, right? So if you have your starter home now and it's like, wow, my starter home's all we're going to have, and then housing falls by 50%, on the one hand, there's a capital loss. On the other hand, you can now afford a much nicer house. So it's not that clear that they lose out from that. And then for things like, do you want your kids to be able to live in the same area as you? Well, in that case, you're either going to be paying a down payment for them, or you want deregulation so that the price can be affordable for your kids. So again, I think it's much more about what I call myopic paranoia of people who are just so focused on any possible downside of construction and like the smallest thing, like it's messing up my view by 1%. All right. So it is. But if we do this, then housing can cost 50% less. So we'll just like get some perspective. Right. So anyway, so that's one thing I'm doing. And then I'm also working on a traditional academic press book called Poverty, Who to Blame? And this is one where a third of it is just going over immigration in a lot more detail. And then a third of it is talking about poverty in the third world and how it's basically almost entirely a needless policy disaster. So like, if kind of the third world had just followed reasonable orthodox economic policies since the end of World War II, there'd be almost no poor countries left on earth. And so it's that. And then finally, I also talk about irresponsible behavior, which is almost on whenever I give a talk in the book, 95% of the questions are about that part, right? And like I say, look, I have this as it's one of 3 big parts. I definitely want to talk about it because I think it's so neglected. It doesn't mean that, but somehow the very fact that I bring it up makes people mishear me as saying it's all poverty is caused by irresponsible behavior, which I totally don't think. But I will stick my neck in and say it's an important cause. It's an important cause. So, one nice illustration of this is research on the so-called success sequence that says that in the United States, if you just finish high school, work full time, and get married before you have kids, that very simple formula almost guarantees that you will not be below the poverty line. So, and that's useful information, right? Whatever else it is, it's something that you'd like people to know. Say, hey, like it's not hopeless actually. So, like just feel, and again, this is not saying win a Nobel Prize and you'll never be poor. Where it's like, well, thanks a lot. No, it's just saying three things that are doable by almost anyone of very modest intelligence, and it's doable.
Yeah.
Right. So just mentioning that, but then like the book is also it's the most philosophical book. Sorry.
Of modest intelligence is quite the caveat, isn't it?
Yes,
like,
yes.
Huge
portion. But like you don't have to be bright to do any of these things. Right, like standards in American high schools are low. You don't have to be of average intelligence.
But how many people have IQs below 90? I mean, that's a huge portion of the population.
Yeah, so even 90, I don't think it's actually hard to finish American high school.
Yeah,
because standards are so low, and they want to pass people through. You just really have to just try.
Would the implications be sort of because I don't think people of IQ of 90, I mean, no offense to them, that are going to be reading Bryan Caplan's book and then getting their ideas from there.
Yeah.
You think that is sort of a more kind of paternalism is the kind of policy implication here, at least culturally, if not through government?
Well, so I mean, like with a lot of my stuff, I hope that say teachers read it, and then teachers could go and present it to their students. So it doesn't need to be read by the actual person that most needs to hear the message. So so like if so again, like IQ of 90, I think is fine for finishing high school. I think actually decent work ethic plus an IQ of 80, I think you can finish high school with high probability today, just because like guidance counselors will steer you into easy classes, and then you still get the diploma effect. And again, working full time, again, like this is something that traditionally. Like full-time work was absolutely the norm for prime age males of all education levels. It's only in recent decades the idea that you can't expect a male high school dropout to have a job. It's like, well, why the hell not? Yeah. Right. So, like workforce participation in 1945 for prime age males, I think would have been like 96%. You can fact check that for me right now if you want, but it was really high in those days. Mm-hmm. And again, it's not because they they weren't, it wasn't that they were smarter. And Flynn effect says they're probably dumber, right? But again, it's the world got more so physical capabilities. The jobs were physically harder back then. It's just so people were acting more responsibly, I would say, is the most obvious story. And again, and then finally for get married before you have kids. This is not rocket science. This is not saying celibacy. Yeah. Right, it's saying you get used contraception until you got married, until you're married, which is the same thing that almost everybody's parents, teachers have been telling them their whole lives. So just listen to them. Throw them a bone. Your parents are giving you some decent advice in this case. So follow it. Yeah, I think people would say, I don't know if this argument is true, but they would say, well, the world was simpler. There was more manual labor compared to whatever people do today. They need but manual labor is hard. I agree, but for someone with an IQ of 75, maybe manual labor is not so hard relative to, I don't know, whatever, being a receptionist or whatever you'd expect people to do. Yeah, today. Well, I mean, probably someone with they might be working as like an orderly at a nursing home, something like that, where. So again, there's still tons of very low skill jobs. I mean, I remember like a pretty standard result on this wage polarization is that actually, while there was a big decline in wages for moderate decline for wages for low skilled workers, what's happened in the last 20 years has been that very low skilled workers have actually seen rises in their income, and it's the middle skilled workers that seem to be doing the worst now. Mm-hmm. So basically, the labor market seems like they have now seen low skilled workers are undervalued. And there's actually there's plenty of employment for very low skilled workers. Again, it's not like I'm not going to say that it's fun, but on the other hand, it's not the really hard kind of work that such workers would have done in 1945. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so. I love your combination of bleeding hearts for the poor masses of the world, and at the same time hard-headedness about people. Yeah, that's an unusual combination. But you seem to hold these views that a lot of people seem unable to hold at the same time. But I think are not. Yeah. I mean, a lot of it is just out of sight, out of mind. When if you don't see someone every day, then you don't care about them. And you'd hope that academics would be different, but unfortunately, most of them are not. Yeah. What's do you have an estimated time of arrival on those two books? So the graphic novel, I'm supposed to have the storyboards all done by Thanksgiving, and then my artist should have it all drawn by about a year after that, and then figure maybe another 6 months after that for it to be out. So that one's sooner. The poverty book, truth is, like on my academic books, I work slowly because I want to get it right. And I just feel uncomfortable writing when I haven't read enough. which does slow me down. And many people said, just cut some corners and no one will ever know the difference. Like, oh, I'll know the difference. It just bothers me.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I did spend 6 years writing The Case Against Education. So the poverty book, I've been working on that more off and on for about 2 years. So, I mean, I say like optimistically, it'll be done in 3 years, probably more like 5 years, honestly. I think it'll be really good when it's done.
Great. Well, we'll look forward the short run. We'll look forward to the housing book. And yeah, this was really fun. Thanks for joining us,
All right.
Bryan.
Yeah. My pleasure.